Cops arrest black woman on false charges. Then the highest-ranking NSA official walks into court. There's a saying in Arcadia Hills, nothing ever changes here. The streets are quiet, the faces are familiar, and the town carries the kind of charm that belongs in postcards. But beneath the surface, something was shifting, something that made certain people very nervous. On a scorching June afternoon, Ebony Parker stood on the sun-baked steps of the community center, holding a stack of flyers in her hands. She wasn't a politician, nor was she looking for fame. She was simply a woman who believed her town could be better. But belief alone wasn't enough, not when those in power had something to lose. She had no idea that at that very moment, behind closed doors, her name was being spoken in hushed, urgent tones. A plan was unfolding, one that would turn her world upside down. And once it began, there would be no turning back. What really happened that day? And how did the truth finally come out? Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Arcadia Hills was a place of pretty picket fences and tall, shady oaks. It had the small-town charm many people romanticized. Friendly shopkeepers, a picturesque main street, and a sturdy clock tower in front of City Hall. In the summer, the midday heat could be punishing, but it rarely stopped residents from gathering in the town square for farmers' markets, music, and conversation. Beneath this layer of neighborliness, however, simmered a tension that had begun to rise slowly over the past year. On a scorching June day, Ebony Parker stood on the concrete steps outside the local community center, fighting the sun's relentless glare. She was tall and slender, with deep brown eyes and a determined set to her jaw. Ebony's t-shirt read "Community Matters," and she clutched a sheaf of flyers in one hand. The flyers advertised a forthcoming meeting aimed at discussing police accountability, something Ebony believed her town desperately needed. At 29, Ebony was already a respected figure in Arcadia Hills. She chaired a community advocacy group named Voices United, which worked for transparent policing, youth mentorship, and social justice. Ebony never set out to be a public face of activism. She had grown up loving her hometown, believing in its potential. But as allegations of racial profiling and unreasonable force mounted against the Arcadia Hills Police Department, AHPD, she found herself thrust into a leadership role. More and more neighbors were coming to her, telling stories of roadside stops that turned into intimidation, or arrests that made little sense. She could not stay silent. Flyers in hand, Ebony paced the sidewalk as residents trickled by. She offered a warm smile to everyone. Some took the literature eagerly, nodding in agreement about the need for more accountability. Others waved her off, apparently wary of stirring any trouble. Tension had grown after several young people of color in Arcadia Hills came forward, recounting troubling encounters with local officers. Ebony had no direct evidence of wrongdoing, but the patterns were too consistent to dismiss. "Thank you for coming to the meeting if you can," Ebony said to a middle-aged man who paused to read her flyer. "We'll discuss how to build trust, not tear down the department. The goal is fairness." The man met her gaze. He seemed conflicted. "I appreciate that. I hate to think our police would single people out, but I guess I'll come listen." Ebony exhaled, trying to manage the swirl of concern she felt every day. The stories she heard were raw and unsettling, yet she believed reform could happen through dialogue and policy changes. Her father had taught her that. A man deeply devoted to the idea of American democracy, Walter Parker had once worked for the National Security Agency as a cryptographer, traveling to Fort Meade daily. He had died from an illness when Ebony was only 16, but he had instilled in her a core lesson: never be afraid to stand up for what's right. By late afternoon, Ebony found herself drained. She took a seat on a bench outside the community center, sweat trickling down her temples. Her phone buzzed, a text from a friend reminding her about an upcoming vigil for a local teen who had been roughed up during an arrest. She typed back a quick acknowledgement, her resolve growing. Something had to change in Arcadia Hills. The question was whether the system would even entertain reform, or if entrenched interests would push back. In an office just half a mile away, That very question was being weighed. Inside the Arcadia Hills Police Department building, modern in design, walls plastered with official slogans about service and courage, two officers discussed Ebony Parker in hushed, urgent tones. Captain Bradley Walker, a bulky man in his 50s, tapped a thick folder labeled Parker on his desk. "She's got everyone riled up," Walker grumbled to Lieutenant Martin Clark. "She's talking about oversight committees, mandatory body cams, all kinds of stuff. If her group keeps building momentum, we'll have the feds sniffing around next." Clark, a lean, sharp-eyed man, leaned forward, arms crossed. "She's squeaky clean. No criminal record, no questionable associates. But Cap, we can't keep letting her drag our reputation through the mud. People are noticing." Walker regarded him with a long, critical stare. "Then find a way to stop her. Silence her. We can't have the public believing she's the face of truth and we're the villains." Clark nodded, though a flicker of apprehension crossed his features. What he didn't voice was the real fear. Ebony Parker was not just an activist. She was also the daughter of a well-respected NSA agent, someone who might still have connections in high places. If they provoked her too much, it might backfire. But the captain seemed determined, and Clark's career ambitions overshadowed his reservations. Ebony Parker had no idea she was being singled out for an underhanded operation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she left the community center, scanning the quiet streets. That night, she would draft more proposals, update social media pages, and encourage neighbors to attend the next council meeting. In her mind, each conversation was a step toward a fairer world. Yet in the corridors of power, a plan was germinating, a plan that would upend her life and test every value she held dear. 2 weeks after Ebony's day of outreach, the Arcadia Hills Police Department became a hive of clandestine activity. Late one evening, Captain Bradley Walker sat alone in his office, blinds drawn, glaring at a computer screen that displayed Ebony's public social media posts and local news segments featuring her. A swirl of anger danced behind his eyes. Walker could feel the pressure mounting from local officials and community leaders, all because Ebony was stoking discontent. Abruptly, he picked up his phone and dialed Lieutenant Clark. "Meet me here in 20 minutes, he said, his voice cold. Clark arrived, still in uniform, eyes darting around to ensure no one was watching. Walker motioned him into the office and shut the door. "I've got the mayor breathing down my neck saying we have to address community complaints," Walker growled. "They're talking about a civilian review board. That's Ebony Parker's handiwork." Clark nodded. "A few old guard cops would probably lose their jobs if that comes to pass. The department's morale is already shaky." Walker huffed. "We're not letting that happen. I've been in this town too long to let some activist ruin the force. You said you'd find a way. We can't wait forever. She's building momentum." Clark exhaled, lowering his voice. "We have no real dirt on her, so maybe we create something. We can set her up for a drug bust. She organizes youth events, so no one would see it coming." Walker considered this, brow furrowed. Risky. If it goes wrong, we could face a federal investigation. Her father was in the NSA, right? Clark shrugged. "He's gone now. She doesn't seem connected at that level. If we're careful, we'll make it look legit." His eyes flickered with cunning. "We have a few street informants who could claim she's dealing or say they saw her with substances in her car. Then we swoop in. Once she's got a record, her credibility goes out the window. Problem solved." Walker tapped a pen against his desk, the rhythmic click echoing. "Fine, but it has to be airtight. We can't leave a shred of doubt." Thus began the seeds of Ebony's impending nightmare. Clark enlisted the help of Officer Timothy Reyes, a pliable young recruit eager to please superiors, and Officer Jeff Perkins, a veteran who owed the captain a favor. Over the next few days, they discreetly compiled a manufactured case file, forging entries into the departmental system. An anonymous tip got logged, claiming Ebony Parker was involved in narcotics distribution. Meanwhile, Ebony continued her life unaware, meeting with local pastors, organizing a fundraiser for after-school programs, and speaking at city council workshops. She believed the system, though flawed, could be reformed with persistence and communication. To Ebony, her hometown remained a place worth saving. The tension between Ebony's idealism and the department's clandestine plot might have felt like an improbable movie script, had it not been real. On the surface, Arcadia Hills carried on as usual, with residents strolling the sidewalks and families frequenting the ice cream parlor. But beneath that glossy veneer, a powerful chess match was in motion. The next move would be Ebony's arrest, shockingly public, carefully orchestrated, and so brazen that few would dare suspect it was a frame job. Far away at Fort Meade, the name Walter Parker occasionally popped up in certain circles. Some of his old colleagues still remembered him fondly, praised his brilliance, and wondered how his family was doing. Word had not yet reached them that Ebony Parker was under threat, but in a matter of weeks, events in Arcadia Hills would echo far enough to awaken those dormant connections. For now, Ebony slept peacefully, unaware of the dark path being laid for her. She would soon learn that confronting injustice sometimes triggers the deepest malice in those who crave power. What Ebony could not anticipate was the dramatic intervention that would arrive from the very top of an institution her father once served. Late on a Sunday afternoon, Ebony parked her old sedan at Field and Family, the local grocery store chain in Arcadia Hills. The store was modest but well-stocked, a place she frequented for fresh produce. She needed ingredients for a simple chicken stir-fry, something quick to prep before hosting a planning call for the next community event. Car windows down, Ebony caught the heavy scent of the summer air. She grabbed her purse, stepped out, and stretched her arms, feeling the day's warmth radiate from the pavement. The parking lot was about half full, families loading groceries, a few elderly couples heading inside. It felt ordinary, safe. She walked through the automatic doors, greeted by the cool blast of air conditioning. For the next 20 minutes, Ebony lost herself in the routine task of buying vegetables, seasoning packets, and a box of cereal. She moved through the aisles, occasionally chatting with neighbors who recognized her from community events. If she had any concern, it was about finishing her shopping in time to prep dinner and review an email from a local pastor about forming a police oversight committee. Ebony paid at the register, scanning her loyalty card to get a small discount. The cashier, a friendly teen named Germaine, bagged her items with a bright smile. "Hope to see you at the next youth forum," Ebony said, giving him a playful wink. He nodded eagerly, saying he'd do his best to attend. Balancing 2 bags in one hand and her keys in the other, Ebony stepped back into the parking lot. The sun had begun its late-day descent, painting the sky in pale orange streaks. She hummed softly, feeling a flutter of optimism. Maybe progress was possible if enough people cared. Suddenly, she heard the squeal of tires. 2 police cruisers whipped into the parking lot, lights flashing. Ebony's first thought was that someone inside the store must have called in a theft or an emergency. Yet as she turned, her stomach dropped. The cruisers angled directly toward her car. Lieutenant Martin Clark emerged from the driver's seat of the first cruiser, flanked by Officer Perkins. Ebony froze, confusion boiling up. She had no reason to fear them, she had done nothing wrong, but the scene was menacing. Clark advanced, hand resting on the holstered weapon at his hip. "Ebony Parker," he said, voice echoing through the tense silence. "Yes?" Ebony managed, glancing at the growing circle of curious onlookers. A mother clutching her child, an elderly couple leaning against their car, Germaine peering from the store's entrance. Clark stepped closer. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Turn around and place your hands behind your head." The words hit Ebony like a thunderbolt. Her grocery bag slid from her grasp, fruit rolling across the asphalt. "A warrant for what?" she demanded, voice shaking. "Possession with intent to distribute," Clark replied, "and resisting arrest." Ebony's mouth went dry. This made no sense. She had never touched narcotics in her life. "This has to be a mistake," she stammered. "I don't—" Before she could finish, Officer Perkins yanked her arms behind her back. She felt cold metal clamp around her wrists. Panic rose and Ebony instinctively tensed, but Clark barked, "Stop resisting." "I'm not resisting," she said in disbelief. She tried to calm her racing heart as more people crowded around, some holding up phones, recording. She saw Germain's worried expression from a distance. Clark pulled a small plastic bag from his pocket, waving it for the cameras. White powder glistened inside. "This was on you," he declared, though Ebony had not seen him retrieve anything from her purse. "That's a lie!" Ebony cried, voice quivering with a fury she had never known. "I've never seen that bag in my life." But her protests were drowned out by the scene's chaos. Officers pinned her against the patrol car, frisked her, and stuffed her inside. Ebony's mind spun. How had she gone from picking up groceries to being branded a drug dealer? The last thing she saw before the cruiser doors slammed shut was Germain stepping forward as if to speak, only for Officer Perkins to block his path. Then the vehicle lurched forward, lights still flashing, carrying her away from every familiar comfort. The heat of the day seemed to intensify, pressing in like a suffocating blanket. Inside that squad car, Ebony felt her world splintering into pieces. She wanted to scream at the injustice, but terror clamped around her throat. As the sirens blared, Ebony's mind clung to one desperate thought. Someone out there must know the truth. Someone would help her. For the first time, she realized how it felt to be at the mercy of those sworn to protect yet wielding their power like a weapon. At the Arcadia Hills Police Department, Ebony's arrest was processed swiftly, with an unsettling indifference. She was booked, fingerprinted, and photographed. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed incessantly, reflecting off the glossy tile floor. Despite the swirl of activity, Ebony's ears still rang with disbelief. "Please listen to me," she implored the duty officer who checked her personal belongings. "That bag was planted on me. I've never done drugs, let alone sold them." The officer barely glanced up. "You can talk to your lawyer." Hours passed in a windowless holding cell. Ebony's frantic mind churned through possible explanations. It had to be a setup. The sudden arrival of multiple squad cars, the suspicious bag produced out of nowhere, the practiced routine by Lieutenant Clark. But why? She was just a community advocate, pushing for police reform. And yet, as exhaustion crept in, Ebony recognized a sobering reality. That alone was enough to make enemies in certain corners of power. Finally, she was taken to a cramped interrogation room, its cinder-block walls painted a dull beige. Lieutenant Clark and Captain Walker entered, looking down at Ebony with stern faces. A video camera in the corner blinked, presumably recording. Ebony sat straight-backed, forging the calmest expression she could. "We've got you dead to rights," Walker said, flipping open a folder. "A bag of cocaine on your person. Officer statements confirming you resisted. You could be facing years if you don't cooperate." Ebony's hands, still cuffed, trembled on the tabletop. "Cooperate with what exactly?" She shot back, anger rising. "You planted that evidence and you know it." Clark snorted. "You think we'd risk our careers over some civic volunteer?" "This is real, Miss Parker. We have an anonymous tip, statements, and physical evidence. You can't talk your way out." Her outrage overcame her dread. "I advocate for accountability, and suddenly I'm a drug dealer? This is an obvious frame job. Get me a lawyer." Walker slammed the folder shut. "You'll see the judge in the morning. Good luck." They left, and Ebony was hauled back to the cell. That night, Ebony huddled on a metal bench, burying her head in her hands. She replayed the day's events in her mind. Grocery shopping, the bright lights, Clark's smug voice. She tried to recall every detail. Could she have missed something that might prove her innocence? A store camera or a witness? Perhaps Germain saw something. She also thought of her mother, Carolyn, and felt a pang of guilt imagining the distress this news would cause. Carolyn had always supported Ebony's activism, though she worried about friction with the police. Ebony wished she could tell her mother she was okay, relatively speaking, and that she would fight to clear her name. But she had no access to a phone. No calls were being allowed yet. Sleep was impossible. The cell's overhead fluorescent lamp never dimmed, and fear rattled Ebony's nerves. She worried that she would be lost in the system, that her voice would be drowned out by official statements. The next morning, A bleary-eyed Ebony was escorted into a courtroom for her bail hearing, wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in. Attending was Delilah Brooks, a civil rights attorney who also happened to be a friend of Ebony's family. Ebony nearly wept with relief upon seeing her. Delilah conferred with Ebony briefly before they faced the judge. In a terse hearing, the prosecution painted Ebony as a significant risk, citing her large quantity of narcotics and uncooperative attitude. Delilah argued Ebony's impeccable record, her community standing, and the suspicious nature of the arrest. The judge, clearly torn, set bail at a hefty figure that Ebony herself could never afford alone. However, the community, outraged by the news of Ebony's arrest, pooled together funds, and within hours she was released. Emerging from the station, Ebony blinked in the afternoon sunlight, a swirl of reporters and local residents rushing toward her. Cameras flashed. Voices clamored for her statement. Her mother, Carolyn, pulled her into a fierce hug, tears brimming in her eyes. Ebony's chest tightened with an odd mix of relief and fury. Delilah addressed the media on Ebony's behalf. "We categorically deny all charges. Miss Parker has been framed by members of the police department who find her activism inconvenient. We will fight these charges and seek full exoneration." The microphone-wielding reporters pressed in. "Any idea why you'd be targeted? Is there proof?" Ebony's eyes flicked to Delilah, who gently squeezed her hand to indicate caution. "We'll be gathering evidence," Delilah said firmly. "That's all for now." Escaping into the safety of Delilah's car, Ebony collapsed against the seat, exhaustion bearing down. "Where do we even start?" she asked softly. Delilah gave a determined nod. "We start with your story, Ebony, and we find any witness or camera footage that can confirm it. You've got a lot of allies in this town. We'll prove they're lying." Yet Ebony knew that a fight with the police department was no small matter. Beyond that, a chilling reality took root in her mind. If they were willing to falsify evidence so brazenly once, what else might they do? Within a day, Ebony's arrest became the top headline in the local press. A shocking mugshot of her appeared on front pages beside alarmist titles like "Community Activist Charged with Drug Possession" and "Local Police Bust Alleged Dealer." Some townspeople gasped in disbelief, certain Ebony was innocent, while others whispered that they always suspected something shady about these activists. Meanwhile, Ebony tried to regain normalcy, staying mostly at her mother's home. There she huddled with Delilah, who laid out possible defense strategies, proving Ebony had no history with drug activity, establishing an alibi for the time of the supposed tip, and relying on witness testimony. Ebony noted that Germaine, the store cashier, might have seen something that day. Delilah planned to track him down. Local supporters rallied in front of City Hall, carrying signs that read, "Free Ebony" and "Stop the Setup." Several pastors, teachers, and activists spoke publicly, decrying the idea that Ebony was involved in crime. Their gatherings, however, were met with a heavy police presence. Tensions flared when certain officers confronted protesters, threatening arrests for blocking sidewalks. "Keep it peaceful," Ebony urged her supporters during a brief appearance, her voice amplified by a megaphone. "We want truth, not chaos. I trust we can prove my innocence." But behind her resolve, Ebony felt fear gnawing at her. The more the community mobilized, the more aggressively the corrupt faction of the AHPD might react. A few days after her release on bail, Ebony was startled by a visit from an old family friend, Jerome J. Thompson, a retired NSA analyst who had worked with her father decades earlier. Ebony barely remembered him, a figure from her childhood. Now, gray-haired but with an upright bearing, Jay arrived on Carolyn's porch, hat in hand. "I heard what happened," he said gravely, his gaze flicking across Ebony's anxious posture. "Your father was a good friend. I can't abide seeing his daughter railroaded by dirty cops." Ebony ushered him inside, offering coffee. In hushed tones, she recounted the suspicious arrest, showing him documentation Delilah had compiled. "We suspect evidence tampering, Jay," she concluded, "but we're not sure how to prove it." Jay nodded, scanning the pages methodically. I can't speak officially for the NSA. I'm long retired, but I still have some acquaintances in that world. People who believe in justice. If the local cops are forging evidence, that might become a federal matter if we frame it as a civil rights violation. Ebony felt a flicker of hope. So there might be a way to get outside intervention? Possibly, Jay replied, sipping his coffee. Your father always talked about how you'd do great things. He'd want you protected. Let me see what strings I can pull, or at least direct you to the right channels. For now, be careful. Carolyn stood at the threshold, quietly observing the exchange. She felt a wave of relief. With Ebony's father gone, it meant everything to see an old ally step forward. Thank you, she whispered, eyes welling with gratitude. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, a reminder of Arcadia Hill's volatile state. Protesters continued to flood the streets, some stepping forward with their own stories of alleged police misconduct. Ebony's struggle became a symbol for a broader call to accountability, something that drew the attention of statewide news. She's not just Ebony Parker now, Delilah remarked. She's become a face for everyone who's been harassed or falsely accused. While Ebony appreciated the outpouring of support, the pressure weighed heavily. She wondered if the system would swallow her whole. Yet a new current of possibility emerged. If her father's ties to the NSA could spark federal interest, Ebony might find herself with a far more formidable ally than she ever expected. Little did she know that beyond her mother's door, hush-hush conversations were already taking place in corridors of governmental power. A memo about a suspicious arrest in Arcadia Hills crossed a certain desk at Fort Meade. A name, Walter Parker, surfaced, and faraway wheels began to turn that would eventually roll directly into Arcadia Hills County Courthouse. With the next court date looming, a preliminary hearing that could make or break Ebony's case, Delilah and Ebony spent their days methodically dissecting every known detail of the arrest. They set up a makeshift office in Carolyn's living room, laptops, files, and sticky notes spread across a large wooden table. Carolyn cooked the meals to keep their energy up, but sleep was scarce. Delilah needed hard evidence to undermine the official story. Officer statements, the so-called anonymous tip, lab reports of the drugs. If Ebony's innocence was to be proven, they had to highlight inconsistencies that cast doubt on the police narrative. We can argue that Ebony had no motive to deal drugs, Delilah said, scanning the police report. But that alone won't cut it. We need direct proof that the police acted in bad faith. Are we sure there's no store surveillance footage? Ebony asked, flipping through notes. Field and Family usually keeps cameras on the parking lot. The police are claiming it was corrupted and unreadable. Delilah frowned. Yes, I demanded a copy from the store manager. He said the official channels told him the file was damaged. He tried handing it over, but the recording was basically blacked out. Ebony shook her head in frustration, recalling the day of her arrest. Jermaine might have seen something, but he won't return my calls. He's scared, Delilah surmised. We'll keep trying. A glimmer of help arrived when a local journalist, Tanya Love, reached out to Ebony. Tanya had covered Ebony's activism in the past, writing sympathetic articles about the push for police reform. Now Tanya was eager to dig into potential corruption for an exposé. She came by the house with a notepad, voice recorder in hand. Off the record first, Tanya said. I need to hear your personal account, Ebony. Then if I can confirm details, I'll publish. Ebony told her everything. The sudden swarm of officers, the bag of drugs produced out of nowhere, the forced narrative that she'd resisted. Tanya's eyes widened and she scribbled furiously. I've heard rumors for a while that certain officers in AHPD behave like a personal fiefdom. This might be the tipping point. Be careful, Delilah warned. They're not above intimidation. Tanya nodded. I will, but the public deserves to know. Later that night, Ebony found a moment of quiet, stepping onto the backyard porch. The cicadas hummed in the darkness, and a warm breeze rustled the branches overhead. She remembered childhood evenings spent out here with her father, gazing at fireflies. He'd talk about the importance of integrity and how every individual's effort shaped society. She imagined telling him what had happened. His unyielding sense of justice would have been outraged. But Ebony also knew he would calmly strategize a plan. She drew strength from that memory. If the AHPD thought she would fold, they were mistaken. In the days that followed, small breakthroughs emerged. Delilah found minor discrepancies in the departmental logs. The anonymous tip was time-stamped oddly, and the sequence of events leading to Ebony's arrest seemed out of order. Also, Tanya discovered that certain phone records pointed to calls between Officer Perkins and an alleged drug informant that did not match official documents. These breadcrumbs hinted at a deliberate setup, but they weren't definitive. Moreover, Ebony sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Whenever she drove through town, always with a friend or family member, never alone, she noticed police cruisers tracking her, or unmarked cars parked suspiciously near her house. She documented every encounter, photographing the vehicles when she could. Fear welled in her chest, but she forced herself to remain steadfast. They wanted to intimidate her. She refused to yield. One afternoon, Ebony received a phone call from Jay Thompson, her father's old colleague. "I spoke to someone at the Department of Justice," he informed her. "They're interested in possible civil rights violations. They might send investigators if we can provide enough evidence." Ebony's heart leapt. That could change everything, but we need more than rumors. "Keep at it. In the meantime, be cautious," Jay said. "I've also heard that your father's name is stirring memories among some old acquaintances at the NSA. Don't be surprised if you get a visitor from higher up." Ebony hung up, mind spinning. Was it possible that her father's service record could mobilize an unexpected ally? She didn't want to get her hopes up. Still, imagining an official from Fort Meade stepping in felt surreal, like a far-fetched dream. Yet Ebony could sense momentum building. Local protests, an inquiring journalist, and faint stirrings of federal involvement. If the AHPD was accustomed to pulling strings without consequence, it might find itself dangerously exposed. In that possibility, Ebony found the strength to push forward, determined to uncover the truth, and reclaim the life stolen from her in a single afternoon at the grocery store. The preliminary hearing was just days away, and the temperature in Arcadia Hills climbed to a blistering peak, both literally and metaphorically. Each afternoon brought sweltering heat, and each evening seemed to bring new reports of confrontation between protesters and the police. On a day when Ebony's mother stepped out to buy groceries, she noticed a black sedan idling on the corner near their street. The same sedan appeared again an hour later, parked farther down, its occupants hidden behind tinted windows. Carolyn felt her stomach knot and hurried back inside. "They're watching," Carolyn told Ebony, voice trembling with anger. "They want you frightened." Ebony sighed, the weight of it all pressing down. "They're not making this easy, that's for sure, but we can't hide." Delilah arrived around noon carrying her laptop. "I've got updates," she said. "None of them good. Jermaine Gray, the store cashier, is refusing to talk. He's telling me he doesn't remember anything." She plunked down on the living room sofa. "Sounds like intimidation to me." Ebony sat next to her, disheartened. "We need a direct witness who can contradict the police story." Delilah's face softened. "We might need to go bigger. The local system is compromised. We rely on higher authorities to see this through." Just then Ebony's phone buzzed. The caller ID read unknown number. She hesitated but answered. "Hello?" A polite yet firm voice replied. "Miss Parker, this is Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Flanders, aide to General Paul M. Nakasone, Director of the National Security Agency. May I have a moment of your time?" Ebony nearly dropped the phone. For an instant she was too stunned to speak. Delilah shot her a questioning look and Ebony mouthed, "NSA." "Of course," Ebony managed. "How can I help you?" "I'm calling on behalf of General Nakasone," Flanders continued. "We're aware of your situation and your father's years of service at the agency. The general is concerned about recent reports suggesting potential wrongdoing by local law enforcement in your case. We'd like to schedule a meeting, if you're open to it." Ebony, her heart pounding, nodded vigorously. then realized Flanders couldn't see. Yes, absolutely, I'd be grateful. Excellent. We can arrange a discreet location or come to you. We're coordinating with the Department of Justice. Please keep this confidential for now. After Ebony ended the call, Delilah stared at her in amazement. The director of the NSA? Ebony swallowed hard. Excitement and apprehension twinged in her gut. Apparently so. They want to meet. With her hearing only days away, the timing was extraordinary. Ebony felt a swell of hope. If the head of a top federal agency cared about her father's legacy and her predicament, might that help shift the entire balance? At the same time, she feared the local department's reaction if they discovered such high-level involvement. Word of Ebony's potential federal lifeline spread quietly among her closest supporters. Stay cautious, Tanya Love cautioned. I've seen what happens when local corruption senses it's being cornered. They can lash out. And lash out they did. A day later, Ebony's car windshield was smashed in her driveway. No valuables were taken. A crude note reading "back off" was left under a wiper blade. Delilah insisted on reporting it, but Ebony doubted the police would do more than feign concern. She decided to inform the DOJ contact Jay Thompson had mentioned. When Ebony arrived to make her official statement at the station, she was met by contemptuous stares from certain officers. She left in a hurry, feeling their eyes sear into her back. Nights became sleepless. Ebony found herself jumping at small noises. Carolyn began triple locking every door. Even so, the calls, the subtle threats, and the silent watchers followed Ebony like a dark cloud. But the intimidation failed to break her. She pressed on, fueled by righteous anger and the knowledge that giving up would mean letting corruption stand unchallenged. Somewhere out of sight, a plan was coalescing. A plan to bring Ebony's case to a definitive turning point. She sensed it in the sudden hush whenever she mentioned the name Nakasone. Yet Ebony couldn't fathom that the top figure of the NSA might literally walk into her hearing, shining a powerful light on the darkness swirling in Arcadia Hills. The morning of Ebony's preliminary hearing dawned gray and muggy. Rain threatened but refused to fall, leaving the air dense with humidity. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, forming a throng of microphones, cameras, and notepads. A line of community members stretched down the sidewalk, many wearing T-shirts with Ebony's face and the words, "Justice for Ebony." Ebony arrived with Delilah and Carolyn, entering through a side door to avoid the frenzy. Her heart thundered. The hearing would determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. In Ebony's worst fears, she pictured herself indicted on multiple felony counts, her future crumbling. But she clung to the notion that the truth, if given a fair chance, would prevail. Inside the courtroom, Ebony's supporters filled the seats on one side. On the other, local police officers, including Captain Walker and Lieutenant Clark, sat near the prosecution table, exuding a smug confidence. Assistant District Attorney Sharon Eckhart represented the state's case, armed with thick binders and a condescending smile. The judge, Honorable Robert Mayfield, stepped in, wearing an expression of measured neutrality. "We'll hear arguments today on whether this case meets the threshold to move to trial," he announced, rapping the gavel. The prosecution laid out the story. Ebony Parker was discovered with a substantial bag of cocaine, attempted to resist arrest, and had no explanation for the suspicious anonymous tip. Eckhart claimed Ebony's activism was a front, an effective cover for illicit activity. Ebony's jaw tightened. The official narrative sounded so plausible, so neatly packaged. Delilah responded, highlighting Ebony's spotless record, her visible community leadership, and the suspicious circumstances of the arrest. She pointed out the irregularities in the police timeline and the store's missing footage. "We contend that Miss Parker was framed," Delilah said firmly. "In retaliation for her activism, we ask for immediate dismissal of these charges." A ripple of tension spread through the courtroom. Judge Mayfield leaned forward. "Do you have any direct evidence to support that Miss Parker was framed?" Delilah hesitated, then called Ebony to the stand. Ebony recounted her day, the normal grocery trip, the abrupt arrival of multiple police vehicles, and the moment Lieutenant Clark produced the mysterious bag of cocaine she had never seen. She spoke with conviction but not without trembling. She saw doubt flicker across the judge's expression. Next, Delilah called Tanya Love, who testified about investigating the story and finding leads indicating departmental misconduct. She also referenced Jermaine Gray, who initially claimed to witness suspicious police behavior, though Jermaine had since gone silent. The prosecution hammered back, painting Ebony as cunning, Tanya as biased, and the missing footage as merely technical failure. Ebony's stomach knotted. The outcome felt uncertain. Then, in the midst of tense back and forth, the courtroom doors opened, drawing every gaze. In walked General Paul M. Nakasone, director of the National Security Agency, accompanied by 2 aides. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators. Cameras clicked madly. Judge Mayfield blinked in open astonishment. General Nakasone, impeccably dressed in a civilian suit, approached the bench with measured calm. "Your Honor," he said, voice carrying softly yet firmly, "I request the court's indulgence in allowing me to provide relevant information. It pertains to Miss Parker's father, Walter Parker, who served under me, and recent federal inquiries into possible civil rights abuses in Arcadia Hills." The judge's eyebrows shot up. "General Nakasone, this is highly unusual, but proceed." Delilah glanced at Ebony, eyes wide. Ebony swallowed, an intense mixture of relief and nervousness surging in her veins. Nakasone produced a folder. "We have reason to believe that digital evidence in Miss Parker's case was tampered with. Our forensic specialists, in coordination with the Department of Justice, recovered partial footage from Field and Family Security System, footage thought corrupted. It appears to show an officer placing a packet in Miss Parker's vehicle while she was inside the store." A stunned silence ensued, broken only by the rustling of the prosecutor's papers. Ebony's heart soared. She glanced at Clark, who sat rigid, eyes darting. Walker's complexion had gone ashen. General Nakasone handed the judge a set of still frames. "Our analysis suggests Officer Jeff Perkins is visible in these frames, opening Miss Parker's car door minutes before the arrest." Judge Mayfield examined the images, lips tight. He looked up. "ADA Eckhart, do you have an explanation for this?" Eckhart glanced frantically at Walker and Clark. "This is the first we're hearing of such footage," she stammered. Nakasone addressed the judge once more. "Furthermore, the Department of Justice is launching an official investigation into allegations of wrongdoing by certain members of the Arcadia Hills Police Department. We respectfully request this court consider these new findings before making any determination on Miss Parker's case." Whispers and gasps filled the courtroom. Ebony felt tears prick her eyes. She never imagined her father's legacy would lead the NSA's top official to walk into her hearing with exonerating evidence. The power of the moment took her breath away. The judge called for order. Hammering his gavel, he turned to Ebony's side. "Given this development, I will allow time to authenticate these findings. But if legitimate, this evidence profoundly undermines the state's claims against Miss Parker." The prosecution's carefully constructed case had begun to collapse in real time, like a sandcastle eroding under a rising tide. And Ebony, shaken but vindicated, realized at that moment that the presence of a single unstoppable truth had arrived, courtesy of the highest seat in the NSA. In the days that followed General Nakasone's bombshell testimony, the legal and political landscape in Arcadia Hills shifted with staggering speed. Judge Mayfield ordered an immediate halt to further proceedings against Ebony until the newly revealed footage could be thoroughly authenticated. Delilah pressed the advantage. She filed a motion to dismiss all charges against Ebony, citing egregious prosecutorial misconduct and deliberate police framing. The footage Nakasone had delivered, partial though it was, clearly showed a uniformed officer tampering with Ebony's vehicle. The Department of Justice swiftly descended on the police station to seize computers, logbooks, and personal phones from several officers. Captain Walker and Lieutenant Clark found themselves at the center of a whirlwind. The mayor, under public pressure, placed them on administrative leave. Rumors swirled that a criminal indictment for conspiracy and evidence tampering was imminent. Officers who had once stood proudly by them began to distance themselves, refusing to risk their own careers. For Ebony, it was both terrifying and liberating to watch the AHPD, which had paraded her mugshot around, now facing a potential meltdown. She remained cautious, fearful of retaliation, but found solace in the knowledge that the truth was surfacing. Her biggest relief came 2 weeks after the hearing, when Judge Mayfield reconvened the court. Delilah, Ebony, and Carolyn entered the chamber, bracing for the final word. The seats were packed, journalists, activists, local citizens craning their necks for a glimpse of the outcome. Judge Mayfield's tone was stern as he banged the gavel. "I have reviewed the partial video footage provided by federal investigators, and it indeed shows an officer appearing to plant illegal substances in Miss Parker's vehicle. Given this evidence, along with the Department of Justice's ongoing probe, I see no legal basis to continue these charges." Ebony's breath caught. Her heart pounded in her ears. "Therefore," the judge continued, "all charges against Miss Ebony Parker are hereby dismissed. Court is adjourned." A roar of cheers erupted from Ebony's supporters, and tears streamed down Carolyn's cheeks as she hugged her daughter. Delilah squeezed Ebony's hand, eyes shining with triumph. Outside, a flurry of reporters waited for comment. Tanya Love, the journalist who had doggedly pursued leads, approached Ebony first. "How do you feel?" she asked, microphone thrust forward. Ebony steadied herself, voice shaking with emotion. "I'm relieved, grateful, but this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else endures a false arrest. Our community deserves a department we can trust." General Nakasone was not present in court that day. He had quietly returned to his duties. But Ebony would never forget his intervention. Indeed, the entire country was taking note of the story now. A small-town activist, framed by corrupt officers, exonerated through federal intervention, aided by an NSA director who had once admired her father's service. The aftermath for Walker and Clark was swift. A grand jury indicted them on multiple charges, including civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and filing false reports. Within months, both men faced the prospect of lengthy prison terms. A handful of other officers also found themselves under investigation. The scandal forced the mayor to publicly acknowledge a broken culture within the AHPD, promising reforms and a complete overhaul of senior leadership. Nevertheless, Ebony felt the toll of her ordeal. She had spent sleepless nights expecting a knock on the door, or worse. Yet from the darkest days came a chance to transform the system she once tried to reform from the outside. Delilah, Ebony, and community allies formed a new advocacy coalition, ensuring that the public pressure for accountability didn't fade once the headlines moved on. "Sometimes, the path to justice is so crooked that you can't see the end," Delilah said at one of their meetings. But Ebony's case shows what happens when people refuse to back down, even when the stakes are high. Ebony, hearing those words, thought again of her father. She believed he must be proud that she stood up for herself and for all those who had been voiceless. Above all, proud that she carried forward his steadfast belief in truth and integrity, no matter the cost. In the immediate wake of Ebony's exoneration, national media seized the story. News anchors hailed the case as a compelling example of hard karma. The men who tried to weaponize the law against her faced the same system that now threatened their freedom. Interview requests poured in from talk shows, podcasts, and social media influencers. Some wanted Ebony to become a national figure, an icon of standing up to corrupt policing. Ebony accepted only a few carefully chosen appearances, mindful that true change meant staying grounded in her community. Each time she spoke, she emphasized the broader issues: biased policing, the fragility of civil rights, and the courageous stand required of everyday people when institutions fail. Locally, the shock waves were still fresh. Arcadia Hills faced the urgent task of restoring public faith in law enforcement. The city council formed a committee of citizens, faith leaders, and legal experts to recommend reforms. An interim police chief was appointed to clean house, and a flurry of disciplinary actions followed. Some officers resigned rather than face deeper scrutiny. Ebony's group, Voices United, evolved. No longer just an activist circle, it now functioned as a watchdog organization, documenting citizen complaints, advising on policy, and pushing for greater transparency. Ironically, Ebony's false arrest had propelled the very changes the corrupt officers feared. The everyday people of Arcadia Hills, galvanized by Ebony's bravery, demanded better. In one city council meeting, Ebony stepped to the podium, greeted by applause. She spoke calmly, no longer trembling with the trauma of her arrest. "When justice fails for one person, it fails all of us," she told the council members. "But we have a chance right now to build a policing model that's equitable and respectful. Let's not waste it." A standing ovation followed. Outside, Ebony found herself swarmed by neighbors thanking her or offering supportive hugs. She was grateful, but tired. She had not had a truly restful night in months. Some part of her still flinched at the sight of a police cruiser, haunted by memories of being handcuffed and thrown into the back seat. One evening, she received a phone call from Jermaine Gray, the grocery store cashier who'd gone silent. His voice was tremulous. "I'm sorry," he said. "They came by my house, threatened my job, my family. I was scared. I wanted to help. Ebony's heart softened. "Jermaine, it's okay. I understand. They did everything they could to cover their tracks. I just hope you're all right." He cleared his throat. "I am now. I'm glad you got justice, if there's ever anything I can do." She thanked him, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. The truth might have come out faster if Jermaine had felt safe to speak, but Ebony didn't blame him. This was the reality of a broken system. People felt powerless against official intimidation. Meanwhile, Ebony and Delilah found themselves consulted by other communities facing similar battles. Their story had set a precedent. If the local system was stacked against the innocent, external resources, federal investigations, media scrutiny, civil rights groups could tip the scale back toward justice. Ebony hesitated to take on too much, mindful that she wasn't a lawyer, just a woman who survived an ordeal. But she shared her experiences, hoping they might help someone else. Though Ebony was cleared of all charges, the trauma lingered like a shadow. She still had nightmares of being grabbed in a parking lot, of hearing the metallic click of handcuffs. Yet each morning she woke determined to reshape the reality that had once almost crushed her. She intended to wield her newfound platform responsibly, mindful that so many others never received the chance to prove their innocence. Outside her home one evening, Ebony watched a summer storm roll in. Lightning streaked across the sky. She breathed in the charged air, recalling how close she'd come to losing everything. She whispered a silent thanks to her father, whose reputation had drawn the attention of General Nakasone, to Delilah, who had fought tooth and nail, and to everyone who had refused to let injustice stand. She vowed never to forget that even the mightiest systems could be confronted when truth was on your side, and sometimes that truth arrived in the form of an unyielding, unexpected ally stepping through a courtroom door. Shortly after charges were dropped, Ebony received a small parcel in the mail bearing the NSA seal. Inside, she found a handwritten letter on official stationery. "Dear Miss Parker, your father, Walter Parker, served our country with great distinction. I had the honor of working with him on critical operations that saved countless lives. His dedication was an inspiration to many at the NSA. I'm aware of the ordeal you recently endured. Though I was not able to be in Arcadia Hills on the day of your hearing, I commend your courage and steadfast commitment to truth. Enclosed is a certificate of service honoring your father's legacy. Please accept it as a gesture of our respect. If we may ever be of assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out. Sincerely, General Paul M. Nakasone, Director, National Security Agency." Ebony's eyes misted with tears. Tucked behind the letter was a formal certificate, acknowledging Walter Parker's decades of cryptographic excellence. She held it gingerly, feeling as if her father were right beside her. Showing the letter to Carolyn, Ebony watched her mother wipe tears away. "Your father would have moved mountains to protect you. Carolyn murmured. In a way, maybe he still did. Ebony nodded. The letter crystallized a truth she had felt all along. Her father's moral compass lived on in her, guiding her toward the same principles of honesty, perseverance, and refusal to buckle in the face of injustice. She wrote a heartfelt reply to General Nakasone, thanking him for his intervention and acknowledging the significance of receiving recognition for her father. She didn't know if he would read it himself. People at his level were often distant, but she believed in expressing gratitude. After sealing her letter, Ebony walked onto her porch, noticing the hush of a late summer afternoon. She reflected on the improbable chain of events that had led to her exoneration. It struck her that none of it would have transpired if not for the seeds of integrity her father planted, culminating in the NSA's top official personally stepping into her case. This moment gave Ebony a rare sense of peace in the aftermath of so much turmoil. Yes, scars remained, but she felt stronger, as though forging a new path lit by her father's memory and the unwavering support of her community. The final reckoning for Captain Walker and Lieutenant Clark arrived several months later, in a courtroom not far from the very place they'd once commanded with impunity. Charged with multiple felonies, they appeared in orange jumpsuits, their stoic faces betraying flickers of panic. The local media covered every detail. Ebony followed the proceedings from the front row alongside Delilah. For days, the prosecution presented evidence of fabricated informant statements, falsified police logs, and phone records tying Clark to the anonymous tip. Former colleagues testified against them to save their own skin. One officer admitted that Walker had boasted about taking down Ebony to undercut her activism. When it was Ebony's turn to speak at sentencing, she rose with quiet dignity. "You could have chosen to serve the public honorably," she said, voice echoing in the hushed chamber. "Instead, you weaponized the badge against an innocent person. I pray this teaches us all a lesson. Power without accountability is a threat to everyone." The judge handed down a harsh sentence, prison time for both men, along with hefty fines. Hard karma had arrived in the most tangible way possible. Ebony left the courthouse not exactly rejoicing. Seeing anyone's life reduced to prison was sobering, yet she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The men who tried to destroy her had undone themselves. She turned her face to the autumn sun, letting its warmth wash over her. Justice had been served, albeit after a long, grueling struggle. Now she could truly move on. Arcadia Hills, 1 year later. The small town found itself undergoing a renaissance of accountability. The local paper, the Arcadia Courier, frequently reported on new community police initiatives, oversight measures, and youth engagement programs. The city council had passed reforms, including mandated body cameras, clear complaint procedures, and training on de-escalation and bias. Ebony Parker stood in front of the newly inaugurated Walter Parker Community Center, named in honor of her late father. In the crowd were many residents she now considered friends, including Jermaine Gray, who had grown more confident and volunteered to tutor kids in math. Carolyn smiled in the front row. Delilah, beaming with pride, stood to the side, busily coordinating the day's events. "Today is about honoring a legacy of service and integrity," Ebony said into the microphone, unveiling a plaque with her father's name. "But it's also about celebrating our collective decision to face injustice head-on. We didn't run or cower. We stood up, and we changed things." Applause erupted. As Ebony scanned the crowd, she recognized journalists, state officials, and everyday folks who had once been silent bystanders but now actively shaped their town's future. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-life tales of justice, redemption, and shocking twists, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's so much more to uncover, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.